We continue our exploration of medieval cities. Up to this point, we've talked a great deal about when urbanization or the movement to cities took place, and that when we look at the wide range timeline of history, it really begins right here with the Crusades and the second half of the Middle Ages. We've also looked at where, that it's happening mostly along the coasts and along the rivers where much of the trade is taking place. We're going to see this tight connection between the growth of trade, the growth of the middle class, and the growth of cities, all of which drive changes in the second half in the Middle Ages. So we've explored a little bit about when, where, and why. Now we're going to think about what life was like in those cities and how it led to other changes. Take a moment, using this diagram as a memory trigger, attempt to think about what we learned back in December and January with life on the manor. Pause the video now as you think. Hopefully you remember lots of details about what their homes were like, the jobs they performed. We read some of those secondary sources and gave speeches. We explored primary documents. We did the little plays. All of those were meant to help us wrap our heads around how the peasants, who were most of the people from the Middle Ages, spent much of their lives in the first 600 years on the manor. It's only in the second half of the Middle Ages that an increasing number of people moved to the towns and joined this growing middle class. Even by the end of the Middle Ages, it might only have been 10 to 20% of the population. And while that's a small number and not the majority, they have a big impact on society overall. And it's why it's so important for us to be studying this now. To think a little bit more about what we did last week, pause the video and take a few moments to think about what conclusions and what details you can draw from these images. To review even further, get out handout number 3, which looks like this document on screen. In class, I gave the students about 4 minutes to read the text again. It's a one-page summary of those 3 pages in the textbook. The goal is to keep this as notes to be able to review later on. After you read it, use the passage to plug in the vocabulary at the bottom of the page. Then read the back description on this that comes from a history book on the Middle Ages. Pause the video and do both the front and the back of handout 3 now. Check your answers against mine on screen. We're going to talk about guilds as these very important associations of workers, basically what we would call a modern union. So these are people who came together to form groups that then set rules for themselves and for others. And the goal was to give themselves more power by basically forming an alliance. So if all of the leather workers in a city formed a guild together, they could agree on the same prices so that they weren't competing as intensely with each other. They could agree on standards, meaning how good the shoes had to be and who could be a master. They could negotiate with the people who were selling them their raw materials, and they could work together to kind of donate money to different groups in order to have influence. And so what this is going to do is it's going to help the middle class gain power and be able to use that against those above them. We've already talked a lot about currency, this middle class that's in between the nobles and the peasants. That's where the name comes from, that they're in this middle section. That middle class often followed a specific system of training. In a lot of ways, it was like the knighthood process, where you would begin as an apprentice who was a young, unpaid worker. They got some basic training and they did some basic jobs in exchange for starting to learn a skill and getting usually a place to sleep and food to eat. Once they got older and had learned some of those basics and gained some relationships, then they became a journeyman, which was a person who was paid a pretty low salary to perform some of the easier jobs. And so if this was like a jewelry shop, they might prepare the templates, they might take the orders, they might deliver the goods, but they might not yet be trusted to independently make the items. They might observe instead, or, get practice with this. Once they had gained enough skill, they could submit a test to kind of prove themselves to become a master, and then they would officially join the guild and they could start their own shop or do independent projects. And so it's a lot like that page, squire, knight, except you're learning a business instead of learning how to fight. Pause the video again. Let's review one more time these different sources that we started exploring last week. Try and think of 3 similarities and 3 differences. If you're having trouble, attempt to remember the sentence starters that I had on the board last week. There was the red box and the gray box. Hopefully you're remembering that all 3 are secondary because they've been published in the last 20 years, even though we're studying the Middle Ages. All 3 are credible because they come from big name publishers like Prentice Hall, DK, and World Book. All 3 are informative or objective because they're providing more facts than arguments or opinions. The differences would be is that these 2 are what we call a reference source because they are providing a basic introduction. The textbook and the eyewitness are going to have more text features like images and captions, whereas World Book is mostly text-based. And this one will actually include some primary sources within the secondary explanations. Let's practice how we set up the MLA citations again. Pause the video and think about how you would label each of these pieces. The yellow is the author's name. Remember that they organize it by last name, comma, first name, and then middle initial if they use one. Then we have our article title. The way you know this is an article title and not a complete work of its own is that it's in quotation marks. That's what we use for smaller titles. The larger title, so the independent work or book, is World Book Student, which is the name of the encyclopedia that this is in. Notice that it's italicized. You can either italicize or underline. Don't do both. Pick one or the other. The name of the company is World Book, right? Since this is their major product, their actual company name is right after it, which can be confusing. This is when it was published, so the publication date, and this is the access date. The reason that's important is that digital information often changes, and so we should be aware that this is 5 years old now, which means that if we went back to it, there might be new information on it. Maybe not, because it's a topic that hasn't really changed a lot in the last 5 years, but we still need to be aware. After you're finished with the video, I'll have you complete this new handout, which is the piece from the encyclopedia. You'll import it to Notability and just give me brief answers in the margins. These don't need to be complete sentences. We have the information there. It's just meant to make you process and think and give you notes you can come back to. It will probably take you 10 to 15 minutes if you're doing it well. We'll also then have you get into this third and final source. Before we did that, I talked with students to make us think more about evaluating sources. So for example, which of these titles would we use for this book? It's actually a trick question. You should be thinking both letter A and letter D. Because it's a complete book, we can either underline or italicize, so long as you pick one and use that throughout your whole paper. A lot of people in today's world are using the italics because the underlining can get confusing if you're putting hyperlinks in, especially then if you print it in black and white. It's hard to tell the difference between a hyperlink and just an underlined title, whereas italics would only be for titles. The next question is, who is the publisher? Take a moment and think. In this case, it is DK Publishing, right? And that word publishing might have been a hint there. The publisher is the company who is producing it, or who is sponsoring the website, or who is reviewing it. And so they are the ones who kind of determine if it's credible or not, and if it's worth the money to publish it. They also will invest in things like fact checking and proofreading. And so it's part of how we judge whether something is trustworthy. The author name is different than the publisher, right? This is the person who creates it. This is the person who turns it into reality, right? Who takes the sort of manuscript and formats it and pays the money to have it put out there. These names are the photographers, and so we have to look carefully at this page. What is the name of that page? Think for a moment. This is what we'd call the title page, right? Which primarily is meant to give us these pieces of information. The title, the authors and any kind of contributors, the publisher. The copyright page is usually on the back of that. In this book, here is our copyright page. It often gives more information about the publisher, other people who are getting credit for helping with the book, and then some of the official kind of copyright information, like when it was first published, who owns the copyright, where they're located, and more. In this case, it's good to also consider a little bit more about this source. And so I said that there's kind of two ways to investigate it. The first is to go to the actual company website. So this is DK's website. You can then click on their little About Us link, which means that then you'll be able to learn some information about their mission. You could then follow up even more about this specific book and this specific author. Pause the video to read all of this. Okay, hopefully you're noticing that this is trying to describe that, a lot about exploring and curiosity. This isn't super intense research, but they are trying to pull in expert knowledge and make things fun for young people learning about the past. In this piece, they're really emphasizing that we're getting a mixture here of photographs and descriptions. And that's kind of the selling point of these eyewitness books. And they give some examples of the types of topics that they might give us. It's well worth a minute to let yourself know what this book is supposed to be about. We get a little bit here with the author, but it's pretty simple, and that tends to happen on these websites. They're giving just enough to make themselves sound good so that you will buy their products. If you really want, an outside source, that's where you need to do some lateral reading. And so this is where you would open up a new tab and search for this source and find some other website that you maybe know or trust, which is talking about whether this is worth your time or not. In this case, I pulled something from Common Sense Media, which is a big organization that does a lot of reviews of materials for students. And I think these two reviews give us some information about, what's good or maybe what's the topic of these types of books. Pause the video and look this over. In general, this is a really positive review. They're saying it's a rare find, meaning it's such a good book that there's not many others out there that are this good. They think it's got both strong information and strong visuals. They're providing a lot of different topics for us to explore, but they're not overwhelming. And they kind of consider them engaging without being too much. And so that's what we want when we're first exploring a topic here. This is a pretty positive outside source that lets us know this is worth our time. From there, today I just gave students time to explore the source itself. I reminded them that it's important to begin with the introduction up here. So this is the top left corner. And then when we're looking at each piece, make sure you're looking at the images and the captions together. They're meant to feed off of each other so that you can kind of combine and make some inferences.